Marcus Reed hadn't waited for anything in 11 years. CEOs don't wait. They schedule, they delegate, they arrive precisely when required and leave before the room cools. Waiting is for people who haven't learned how to control time, and Marcus had spent the better part of a decade making time obey him. His calendar ran in 15-minute blocks. His assistant pre-cleared his path through airports. His car idled at curbs, never parked, never patient. He moved through the world like a current, constant, directional, unstoppable. But tonight he stood on Platform 7 at Penn Station, 11:42 p.m., briefcase at his feet, and he was waiting. He couldn't explain it to anyone. He hadn't tried. His driver had offered to stay, and Marcus had dismissed him with a look that ended the conversation before it started. His phone carried 17 unread messages from his COO, 2 from his lawyer, and 1 from a journalist who had been chasing a comment for 4 days. He had read none of them. He stood under the cold fluorescent hum of the departure board and watched the numbers change and felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely still. Platform 7. He hadn't been back here since that night. 11 years ago, this platform had been ordinary. It had smelled like coffee and diesel and the particular exhaustion of a city that never fully sleeps. He had stood right here, not exactly here, perhaps 3 feet to the left, beside the second pillar, and watched her board. She had turned back once at the door of the train, the way she always did, and smiled at him over her shoulder. It was not a dramatic smile. It was not the kind of smile that knew it was being seen for the last time. It was just Catherine, in her grey coat with the slightly frayed left sleeve she kept meaning to replace, smiling at her husband the way she had for 9 years because she loved him and because she was coming back in 3 days and there was nothing to make significant about a goodbye that wasn't one. The train had pulled out. He had walked to his car. He had driven home, eaten something he couldn't remember, and answered 4 work emails before his phone rang at 11:19 p.m. 3 stops out. A mechanical failure. A derailment. 17 people injured. 2 people lost. One of them was Catherine. Marcus had not processed this information the way people expected him to. He had not collapsed. He had not screamed. He had sat down very carefully on the edge of the kitchen chair and placed his phone face down on the table and stayed there for a long time while the kitchen clock moved and the city outside continued its indifferent noise. The world didn't pause. It never does. And somehow that steadiness of the world, that refusal to acknowledge that something irreplaceable had just been removed from it, was the thing that taught him to keep moving too. So he moved. He moved extraordinarily well. Within 6 months, he had thrown himself into a company restructuring that kept him working 18-hour days. Within 2 years, he had expanded the company into 3 new markets. Within 5 years, Marcus Reed was the kind of name that appeared in headlines alongside words like visionary and ruthless, and he accepted both descriptions because they were accurate and because they required nothing from him emotionally. Building things was easy. Buildings didn't ask how he was sleeping. Acquisitions didn't notice that he hadn't been back to the apartment they'd shared, sold it the year after, couldn't, or that he kept her photograph in his desk drawer rather than on his desk because visible grief felt like a conversation he didn't know how to finish. He had managed 11 years this way. And then this morning, his assistant had placed a folder on his desk containing documents for the acquisition of a transit infrastructure company, rail systems, maintenance contracts, signal technology, and somewhere in the dry language of liability assessments and asset valuations, he had read the words mechanical signal failure and something in him had simply stopped. He'd signed what needed signing. He'd attended what needed attending. He'd delivered a presentation in the afternoon that his team later described as his sharpest in years. And then at 10 p.m., when the office entered and his car waited downstairs, he had told his driver to take him to Penn Station instead of home. He didn't analyze the decision. Marcus Reed had not survived 11 years by over-examining the quiet pulls of his interior life. He had learned to let certain things move through him without naming them. This felt like one of those things, a pull, a tide, something below the level of explanation. The station was still open. Platform 7 was still there. He walked to it, set his briefcase down on the cold concrete, and stood. The departure board above him clicked through destinations with mechanical indifference. Chicago, Boston, Washington. The names of cities where people were going, where lives were continuing, where trains arrived safely and passengers stepped onto platforms and were met by people who loved them. He watched the board and felt no envy of this. What he felt was harder to name, something close to gratitude, perhaps. Gratitude that he could stand here now and feel the weight of this place without being destroyed by it. 11 years ago, This platform would have ended him. Tonight it simply held him. The station was quieter than he expected. A few travelers with luggage moving toward the far platforms. A maintenance worker with headphones in, unhurried, pushing a cart. A couple near the entrance, not speaking, comfortable in their silence the way only long-acquainted people can be. Marcus watched them briefly and then looked away, not from pain exactly, but from something adjacent to it, the recognition of a texture of life he no longer lived. His briefcase was Italian leather, a gift from his board after the Asian market's expansion. It had traveled to 14 countries and sat in rooms where decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars were made, and he had never once thought about it the way he thought about Catherine's grey coat with the frayed sleeve. That coat he could still see with a precision that surprised him, that coat he could have described to a sketch artist in complete detail even now. Memory is selective and strange. It keeps what it keeps. The clock on the platform read 11:48. She had boarded at 11:53, 11 years ago. He remembered the time exactly because he had checked his phone right before she kissed him goodbye, distracted by an email notification, and the guilt of that small distraction, that 15-second failure of presence, had lived in him quietly ever since. If he had known. If he had put the phone in his pocket and simply looked at her, simply been there completely for those last 3 minutes. But that was the precise thought he had trained himself not to finish. Not from avoidance. From understanding. He had sat with enough grief counselors in the first year to know that the mind's instinct to construct alternate endings was not healing. It was a loop, a beautiful and destructive loop, and he had made a decision to step out of it. He had stepped out of it. He was, by any measure, a functioning and even flourishing human being who had built something meaningful and would continue to do so. He was fine. He stood on Platform 7 at 11:48 p.m. on the anniversary of the night his life divided itself into before and after, and he was completely, undeniably fine. The fluorescent light above him flickered once. The departure board clicked. A train was incoming on the adjacent platform, its distant approach a low vibration in the concrete beneath his feet, traveling up through his shoes, through his legs, into his chest like a slow, soundless chord. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about Catherine's coat. He thought about the email he'd been reading. He thought about how she had turned at the train door and smiled, not dramatically, not knowingly, just ordinarily, fully, warmly, the way people smile when they are certain of return. He opened his eyes. And that was the moment the voice came from beside him. Unhurried. Unannounced. Not directed at him the way questions usually were, not deferential, not strategic, not angled toward anything. Just a voice, small and steady, that had apparently been standing in its own grief quietly enough that he hadn't noticed its arrival. Are you waiting for someone who's never coming back, too? Marcus turned. She was young, 19, maybe 20, with a duffel bag at her feet and eyes fixed on the departure board the same way his had been. She wasn't looking at him. She had asked the question the way a person sometimes says the truest thing they know, not to communicate it to someone specific, but because the silence has finally become too full to hold it. He looked at her face. He looked at the board. He looked at the platform around them, the quiet, the fluorescent light, the concrete that had held him once before on the worst night of his life and was holding him again now. Something in his chest shifted. Not broke. Not cracked. Shifted, the way a door shifts when the latch finally releases, not violently, just open. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea what she carried. But in 11 years of moving through the world at speed, in 11 years of boardrooms and headlines and careful, controlled momentum, no one had ever asked him the right question. She just had Marcus turn slowly. Not the way he turned in boardrooms, precise, intentional, the practiced pivot of a man who understood that physical presence communicated authority before a single word was spoken. He turned the way a person turns when something unexpected has reached them below the level of defense. Slowly. Completely. The way a compass needle turns when it finally finds north. She was young. 19, maybe 20. She had a duffel bag at her feet, olive green and worn at the corners, the kind of bag that had been carried a long way and would be carried further. Her coat was too light for the night's chill, the kind of detail you notice when you've spent years learning to observe people quickly, to read the room, to understand in seconds what others miss in hours. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the departure board above them, the same board he'd been reading for the past hour, as though its changing numbers contained some answer neither of them had found yet. She had asked the question the way people say the most honest things they know, not at anyone specifically, not with expectation of response, but because something had been held too long in silence and the silence had simply become too heavy to maintain. It was the kind of question that didn't come from curiosity. It came from recognition. She had looked at him standing there, briefcase at his feet, expensive coat, perfectly composed face, and she had seen, not the CEO, not the profile from the business section, not the man his board saw or his competitor studied, she had seen someone waiting. And waiting in that particular way that only happens when the person you're waiting for is no longer in the world to arrive. Marcus stood with the question in the air between them. He was a man who answered questions for a living. In quarterly calls, in press conferences, in negotiations where every syllable was a move in a game with stakes in the millions, he answered questions fluently, immediately, with the precision of someone who had spent decades understanding that how you respond shapes what people believe is true. He had never been at a loss for language. He was at a loss now. Not because the question was difficult. Because it was so exactly right that answering it required him to step somewhere he hadn't stood in a very long time. Yes, he said. One word. He was a man who built paragraphs for a living, and he gave her one word, and it was the most completely true thing he had said in longer than he could accurately measure. She nodded. Not with surprise. With the slow, settled nod of someone who has asked a question they already knew the answer to, who asked it not to learn something new but to confirm that they were not entirely alone in what they knew. Me too, she said. She paused for a breath. My mom. 2 years ago. She still wasn't looking at him. Her eyes stayed on the board. He understood this instinctively, the way grief sometimes requires a fixed point, something external and neutral to anchor you while the interior work happens. He had stared at a kitchen clock for 40 minutes once, for the same reason. The clock had been ordinary. It had been essential. I'm sorry, Marcus said. And he meant it the way people rarely mean it, not as social filler, not as the reflexive offering of a word that fills space when space becomes uncomfortable, but as the genuine acknowledgement that something irreplaceable had been taken from her and that this was a true and significant loss and that his saying so, even to a stranger, even briefly, mattered. She accepted it the same way. A small nod. A slight exhale. Not performance. Just receipt. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. There was something in the quality of the moment that made names feel like the wrong currency. Too small, too transactional, too much the language of networking events and introductions rather than the language of two people standing on a train platform at midnight having accidentally found each other in the geography of grief. She used to travel this route, the girl said after a moment. Every month, to see my grandmother. I came tonight because... She stopped. Try it again. I don't know exactly why I came. I just ended up here. Marcus understood this so completely that it required no response. He had not decided to come here tonight in any conscious sense. He had simply ended up here, the same way water ends up in the lowest available point, not by decision, by nature. Some places pull you back. Some nights on the calendar carry more weight than the calendar admits. I come every year, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It simply came. Tonight is 11 years. She turned and looked at him then, for the first time directly, fully, and he saw her face properly for the first time. She had her mother's eyes, he thought, though he had never seen her mother. It was the kind of feeling a face gives you sometimes, not information exactly, but impression, the sense that this face had been shaped by love and had learned recently what it meant to carry the absence of the person who provided it. Does it get? She started, and then stopped, and almost smiled, a small careful smile. Everyone always told me it gets easier. I don't know if I believe them. Marcus thought about this honestly. He owed her honesty. She had given him honesty without knowing him and without asking for anything in return, and the least he could do was match it. It doesn't get easier, he said. It gets different. There's a difference. He paused, finding the words carefully, the way he almost never had to search for words. Easier would mean it weighs less. It doesn't weigh less. You get stronger than you thought you could be. So the same weight feels different in your hands. She was quiet for a long moment. The station moved around them, the distant announcement of a boarding call, the roll of luggage wheels on concrete, the low ambient noise of a city's transit system continuing its patient, indifferent operation. The world keeping its rhythm regardless. That's the first honest thing anyone said to me about it, she said. People don't like being honest about grief, Marcus said. It makes them uncomfortable. They'd rather give you a timeline. 18 months, she said immediately. as though reading from a list she'd memorized unwillingly. That's what everyone said. 18 months and you'll be yourself again. She looked back at the board. I'm at 24 months. I don't know who myself is anymore, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think I'm someone new. I just haven't finished meeting her yet. Marcus looked at her. This girl with her worn duffel bag and her too light coat and her 24 months of becoming someone new. He thought about his own 11 years, the companies built, the markets entered, the headlines accumulated, the long and productive and carefully forward-facing life he had constructed on the other side of the worst night of his life. He thought about whether he had finished meeting himself yet. Whether the self he'd become in 11 years was the whole answer or only part of one. He thought it might be only part. That's a wise way to hold it, he said quietly. She shrugged, not dismissively, but with the particular shrug of someone who has arrived at a truth not through wisdom exactly but through necessity. I didn't have a choice about losing her. I figured I could at least choose what I did with the losing. The departure board clicked above them. Her train, he didn't know it was a train until she reached down and picked up the duffel bag, appeared on the board with a platform number and a blinking status and all the ordinary operational language of departures. She stood. She lifted the bag onto her shoulder. She looked at him one final time, and in her face was something that Marcus Reed, who had read faces across negotiating tables on 4 continents, recognized as something rare, the look of a person who has given something away freely, without ledger, without expectation of balance. She had shared the truest thing she carried with a stranger on a platform at midnight, and she was leaving lighter than she arrived. I hope whoever you're here for knows you showed up, she said. Marcus had no words for this. He nodded. It was enough. She turned and walked toward her platform. He watched her go, the worn duffel, the too light coat, the steady, unhurried walk of someone who had learned that moving forward was not the same as moving on, that you could carry your grief and still go somewhere, that the destination and the loss could exist in the same body traveling the same direction. She turned a corner and was gone. Marcus stood on platform 7. The clock read 12:09 a.m. The anniversary had passed without his noticing the exact moment it crossed into the next day, which had never happened in 11 years. He had always felt that midnight like a hand pressing down. Tonight it had passed in conversation, in honesty, in the extraordinary ordinary relief of being truly heard by someone who asked nothing from a hearing. He reached down and picked up his briefcase. He stood straight. He breathed. Something in him that had been standing very still for a very long time was not standing still anymore. It wasn't running. It wasn't fleeing. It was simply, quietly, after 11 years of holding completely still in one interior place, beginning, at last, to move. He walked toward the exit. Not away from Catherine. Never away from her. But forward, which, he understood now, was the only direction she had ever wanted him to go.